Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Hello and welcome to this Tech Talk webinar, Creating the Perfect Mapping Spec. To ensure we cover everything in this short 30 minutes, this webinar is following a pretty tight script. So I'm going to ask everyone, please ask questions as they come to you, but I'll be answering those at the end of the presentation during our Q&A period. And you'll find the area for asking questions by scrolling down below the presentation panel toward the bottom of the webinar page. All right, so most of you are familiar with OAG and our OAGIS standard, but since we can never really predict who is our audience on these webinars and which channel they may have navigated to wind up watching our webinars after they're recorded, I'll start with a quick introduction. So I'm Michael Figura. I'm a senior integration architect and serve as the Vice President of Operations, OAG. So OAG is a nonprofit organization founded in 1994, and we're a standards organization. Our goal is to continuously advance business process transaction standards at a global enterprise level. And here's our mission statement. So we're creators and publishers of the OAGIS canonical standard, which is one of the largest enterprise standards on earth for B2B and A2A business process transactions. Our standard is home to over 1,100 business process schemas, which we call BODs, or business object documents. And because we're a member-driven organization, our standard is constantly evolving and improving to better serve our adopters and implementers. And so for nearly 3 decades, OAGIS has helped reduce the cost of integration for organizations across the globe involved in manufacturing, supply chain, ERP, e-com, even accounting and finance. So before we dive into looking at the actual spec, I'd like to talk for a second about the importance of a great spec. I've spent the last 25 years working as an independent consultant specializing in integration and working for more organizations and clients than I can usually remember. So over the years, I've had the privilege of seeing some and working with some amazingly awful mapping specifications. As an example, I was at a client once in a room full of developers, architects, analysts, stakeholders, everyone was there, and they opened up their mapping specification format and projected it onto the giant screen. It was something ridiculous, like 48 columns wide and hundreds of rows tall. And when it appeared on the screen, I said, every time I open this spec, I immediately feel frustrated and stupid. And everyone in the room laughed because they felt the same way. It was true. It was a famously terrible spec that had been designed as a standard by someone in the organization years ago, and it had been adopted with tears and headaches ever since. So the point here is that information is supposed to empower us, not work against us. So and when it's used correctly, a really good mapping spec can deliver or help deliver the following. Number one, calmer and more effective workers. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're looking at a horrible mapping spec and you're feeling that same frustration that I just mentioned, I've seen it many, many times where people start to panic. They don't understand what they're looking at, and that makes the requirements not make sense, which makes people lose patience and get even more frustrated. And before you know it, people are throwing whiteboard markers and storming out of the room and sometimes even yelling. So a great mapping spec can help pull in the reins on the development process in general. And when that happens, obviously, you're going to wind up with happier and more productive developers because they're going to be able to do their jobs much more easily, and everything logically will make sense. And that's going to obviously equate to less mapping mistakes and errors. And from here, it just cascades down beautifully and naturally throughout the project lifecycle. Less mapping mistakes and errors equate to less break-fix project cycles. And that's going to obviously increase the project efficiency. And then ultimately, you're going to wind up with a really improved delivery schedule. So if you're on a project where you find yourself being force-fed a really nasty mapping spec, just remember that you've got the fuel you need right here in these 6 bullet points to create a better spec and sell the new format to upper management and the project team. So basically, you just hand them your new suggested layout, which you'll have at the end of this presentation, and advise them that if they don't correct the format, then that places a lot of risk on all of these 6 factors. So let's talk about the 5 tenets that make a great mapping spec, because I'm going to spell these out pretty plain and simple so that we can apply them when we switch off this. After this slide, we're going to jump over to the actual mapping specification, and it'll make a lot more sense having gone through these. So number 1, I can't stress this first one enough. Keep it simple. Mapping specifications are difficult. Integration logic is difficult and complicated. So we want to start simple, because the complexity is naturally going to introduce itself. So my motto is start simple, stay simple. No side scrolling. I tell this to so many people as I travel around to different organizations and projects. Everyone seems to love these huge Excel files that scroll left to right. Those are a total pain for your developers and your analysts. Developers and analysts are constantly tabbing back and forth between windows and screens. And if they have to leave the mapping spec to go reference something in SAP or some lookup table and then go back to the spec, they've lost their place, and they have to grab the mouse or the left and right arrow keys on the keyboard and figure out where they just were. And that becomes very, very challenging and tedious over time. That's a very taxing on the developer. So on a color palette, a lot of people spend a little bit too much time on this stuff thinking, oh, I've really got to focus on what colors to use. Keep it just simple, clean, use neutral color palettes. And I always tell everybody to avoid contrast changes or heavy contrast changes if they can. It can be very taxing on the eyes and the brain to constantly be switching focus between light colors and dark colors and dark contrasts. So these last 2 are pretty important, and you're going to see them in effect here in just a moment. It's really where the rubber meets the road on a clean specification and something that's easy to work with. But I like to tell people, whatever tool you're using, figure out a way to harness the power of that software to minimize information and make the information accessible only when you think that developer would want to use it, and then make that pretty easy for that developer or analyst to get to it. So in a nutshell, leave it up to them, the person using the spec, to decide when they want to see more information. But when you just open up the spec from scratch, have all of that stuff kind of collapsed and neatly hidden. And when I say hidden, I am not referring to the Excel feature of hiding columns and rows. That will get you into trouble. I'm going to show you a different way to do it in just a second. And this last one's probably the most challenging to grasp mentally here. We want to organize our structure of our data hierarchically and keep the logic contained at the lowest level. And what I mean by hierarchically is I've seen a lot of people over the years try and take the complex hierarchical data structures that they're mapping and try and flatten them into 2-dimensional structures, which causes a lot of brevity, a lot of repeat work. There's no point to it. You can use hierarchical logic within Excel or Word or whatever you're using to document, and keep that logic. And by logic, I mean the logic a developer would have to say if he or she was writing an if-else statement that said, okay, if this is true, do this. That's usually going to be at the field level where you're mapping a field or a couple of rows. So keep it where it belongs, keep it where it lives, and keep it encapsulated at the lowest level. And that'll make a little bit more sense here in just a moment. Now I'm going to switch. We're through with the slideshow, and I'm going to switch now to my Excel spreadsheet. Okay. So if you go to the oag.org website, you will find this in this exact format on our downloads and resources section under white papers and specs. And it's sitting right at the top right now. It's absolutely free to download. And it consists of 2 tabs. One tab is the instructions tab here, where I've kind of spelled out in a documentation format for you and people who use this what to expect and what you're looking at on the example tab. But since I'm doing this webinar live, we'll ignore the instructions tab and I'll just walk you through it. Right. Let's keep our 5 tenets in mind. Keep it simple. Imagine you're a mapping developer, and you want to map whatever is defined here. And so you start with the very top here, the title, business process is process bomb. And our example here is SAP to OAGIS. So I've got some example SAP tables, and these are being mapped to our OAGIS process bomb in the middle here. So that tells us the title. That tells us it's coming from SAP and going to OAGIS. And that also tells me that I can read left to right here. SAP is on the left. It is the source. OAGIS, if we look in column D here, is on the right, and that's the fields that I'm mapping to. Now, I've removed all of the complexity, and from a developer standpoint, they know that they're an SAP table field, STPO, and the field is ID and RK, and that is mapping over to ID. Okay, let's talk about some other things here really quickly. I mentioned keeping the contrast and colors neutral. These are really soft colors. They're easy on the eyes. You can spend 8 hours a day looking at this thing and it's not going to bother you or give you a headache. I've used only harsh contrast to define my header. And when I do hierarchical structure definitions, I'm using a softer color here. STPO is the table. When we get to the next yellow instance, I know that I'm looking at another table, in this case, the STAS table. So 2 fields that I want to talk about that will, for the majority of the discussion, we'll ignore these. But one feature here that's kind of handy is required. This wouldn't be necessarily required in the sense that it's defined in the schema as the required. This would be more at a business level, where the business says, look, that thing is optional inside of OAGIS, but if you don't send it, our system's going to break downstream. So that's what that's for. That confuses a lot of people, and you feel free to change this terminology here if required doesn't make sense to you and your team. The other field that makes some people confused is validated. I like to use this as a handy feature in Agile projects where we only have 16 or 17 of the 80 fields actually mapped over, but those have been confirmed by the business analysts and the system teams, and so the developer can actually start writing mapping code. So you would take this X and make it a check if it was in fact reviewed and ready to be coded. That's really handy if you're on Agile projects. Waterfall projects tend to wait till that mapping specification is at 95%. And a lot of organizations and projects are obviously moving away from that because it's just not as life cycle friendly. Okay, now we talked about no side scrolling. You'll notice that you can't really side scroll much here. This developer is just going to be going up and down with either the mouse wheel or the arrow keys. So that's really handy when you're switching between screens. And then we talked about using the power of the tool that you're using. In this case, it's Excel, to hide and minimize the amount of information. So let's drill down. I'm the developer I'm doing my very first mapping here from ID and RK to the ID OAGIS field. So let's look at this by clicking the plus sign here. And we can see our first set of instructions here. We have a path, and in this case, it's just a flat table, so it's still the field ID and RK. And on the right, we can see the entire pseudo XPath here that drills down into the OAGIS schema. So this tells me exactly where this field is being mapped to inside of the OAGIS schema. We're going to start at process bomb, data area bomb, bomb item data, item, and finally ID. I can see the number of occurrences for that field is defined as 1. And in this case, the source occurs 1 time as well. That tells me I don't have any kind of looping logic. It's a one-to-one mapping. When I find ID and RK in my source, it's mapping straight over to the item ID. Some other nice handy features here. I've got the ID where type code equals bomb component. So in this particular case, I'm going to set the type code on the item ID to bomb component. BOM component, that's basically a material number, in this case in SAP. I put a little comment here. I like to put comments in red. That way they stand out, because comments tend to be something that's not necessarily defined in the logic, but it's defined, but it's important enough that the developer really needs to spot it when they're scrolling through these large specifications. Now I'm going to go down, drill down another level. And by the way, if this is new to you, these plus and minus signs on the left-hand side, if you look at the top here, Excel gives us a really nice grouping function. And that's all this is. I've taken one set of records, highlighted them, and said group. And then I've grabbed the parent. I've grabbed 5 through 16. Around that, and said create me a parent group around that by hitting group again. And so I have a child group, and then I have a parent group around that. And that actually gives us 4 layers. You'll see down here, we're going to navigate this in just a second, but you'll see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll show you how that collapses in just a moment. But I've drilled down into the final level on this record. And what's really nice about this is that I see the entire occurrences and how everything maps to something in a wages. So if I start at STPO, I know that that's going to go straight over to the process BOM. And then from inside of the STPO, I have an ID NRK, and that's mapping straight to ID. There could be, imagine for a moment that we're not working with a flat 2-dimensional SAP table. We're working with another schema similar to a wages that has lots and lots of hierarchical structures. The developer would need to know, let's say hypothetically, that in the middle here there was a record container, and it could occur, X amount of times, or 1 to X, 1 to many, right? That tells me that as a developer, that tells me that I'm going to have to loop for every record container. I'm going to have to create a BOM element or container on the OAGIS side. This is the kind of logic that most specifications leave out, and the developer has to look at that and make an assumption. Well, how do I map this? For every record container, do I just grab the first one and just create 1 BOM and 1 ID down at the bottom? That's usually not the case. There's usually more logic involved in looping through records. That's why we have the for statements in XSLT, etc. It's usually not there's no free lunch with that stuff. And so going through this process of spelling everything out, if you think about it this way, I've done everything except write the actual XSLT mapping code for this developer. The developer using this is going to go, wow, I have no questions. There's nothing left for me to ask. I've got everything I need. Now, let's go back up to the top here, 1, 2, 3, 4. As I click these, we're going to go and drill down into the entire map. So I'm going to go to 2. That's going to extend every single one of the first levels for all of this logic, for every field that needs mapped. I'll go 3. That brings us down into the second logic here, where we get the logic and the comment sections. And then finally 4. Now we can see the XSLT requirements for the occurrences for every single field. Now, this is normally how people deliver mapping specifications. This thing's enormous. It's intimidating. And it's when you're flipping between screens and you're scrolling, you're going to have to go, oh, which one was I on again? And then, have your eyes lean into your monitor and have your eyes focus again. And that's frustrating. So what we can do is minimize everything and go just to the one that we're working on and open up that. So now as I'm scrolling back and forth and swapping between screens, you'll notice right away when I come back to this screen, man, I know that I'm working on the bill of materials type code on the ID on the STLNR field. I'm not going to accidentally look at another mapping and write the wrong logic, because everything's nice and clear for me here. And that's about it. It's not rocket surgery, as I like to say. It's if you keep it simple and stay simple and hide your logic and hide your complexity, and make that available to the developer and analyst only when they want to see it, I think you're going to wind up with a project that's going to run a lot smoother, and your developers are going to be a lot happier. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for uh, visiting this presentation today and viewing it live. And this will be available on the website as a recorded webcast if you want to view it in the future. And I'd also like to remind everyone again that they can get the mapping specification sample from the oag.org website under downloads and resources under the menu item white papers and specs. It's sitting right at the top and it's absolutely free. So thanks again. I'm Michael Figura, and we should have another one of these in a month or two, and I hope to see you there. Thanks. Bye-bye.